The Folger Shakespeare Library in Washington, D.C. is home to the world's largest and finest Shakespeare collection, and the national center of all things related to teaching Shakespeare.
Hi, and welcome to the Folger Shakespeare Library's pilot masterclass on teaching Romeo and Juliet. I'm Peggy O'Brien. I'm the Director of Education at the Folger. This is a place where we believe deeply that teachers do the most important and powerful work on earth. So several of us will tag team for the next hour to provide you with some thoughts for your own brains and some things to do in class tomorrow. And we'll do that by looking at R&J through three lenses: scholarship, performance, and your own classroom. You remember that this is a pilot, an experiment that you got into with us, as we think hard here about professional development that will be most useful to you. So we've sent you a bundle of R&J teaching materials, and tomorrow we'll send you a survey so we can collect your thoughts and opinions on this class and also on other kinds of professional development. But the point of this live masterclass is to connect you with experts and to allow some time for interaction among all of us. So throughout, we'll be taking your questions and comments live. Just type them into the chat box on the web page. We'll get to as many as we can on camera today, and we'll continue the discussion in the Google group as long as you'd like. We also have the wonderful thoughts of teachers whom we taped at the NCTE conference, and they'll be interspersed throughout this hour as well. Now, on to scholarship. Mike Whitmore, Director of the Folger Library, will join Gail Kern-Pastor, Director Emerita of the Folger and Editor of Shakespeare Quarterly, and Ayanna Thompson, noted scholar and professor at George Washington University. These are three scholars whose thoughts on Romeo and Juliet should reinvigorate your own thinking about the play. But first, we're going to take a quick trip to the Folger reading room in this clip of Gail Pastor being interviewed by a high school student about the differences between early printed versions of Romeo and Juliet. You'll find more about these versions in your bundle. Let's take a look.
Today we have the privilege not only of meeting in the Elizabethan-inspired Pastor Reading Room, but also of chatting with Dr. Gail Kern-Pastor. Dr. Pastor is the former director of the Folger Shakespeare Library and has spent countless hours immersed in research in this very room. Thank you for joining us today, Dr. Pastor.
It's great to be here.
So scholars from around the world come here to study artifacts from the vault and bring them up to the reading room. What sorts of things are scholars like you working on?
Well, because we have the world's largest Shakespeare collection, scholars who are working on Shakespeare do come here, particularly editors. But what we know is, in fact, that only 25% of scholars here work on Shakespeare. So that scholars come from all over the world to use the collection to work on the history of the Reformation, the history of women, political history, social history, early American history, the history of science. The range of topics is absolutely huge.
So how does looking at the books and manuscripts in the Folger collection help us understand Shakespeare? Are the words of Romeo and Juliet the same today as they were 400 years ago?
There really are two ways to answer the question. On the one hand, Shakespeare writes modern English, but in fact the meaning of the words changes a great deal. So, for example, take the word virtue, which Friar Lawrence uses to describe the plants that he's been gathering. He talks about their virtues excellent. We think of virtue as meaning a moral quality, like kindness or goodness. But for Shakespeare, the word really means power or strength or attributes, so that Friar Lawrence is talking about the strengths of the plants that he's been gathering. The other answer really has to do with the words that Shakespeare writes and how we can find out as closely as possible what they are. And sometimes the earliest versions can differ quite a bit. So, for example, in Romeo and Juliet, in the first quarto, in Act 2, Scene 6, the wedding scene, the first quarto of 1597, Romeo comes in and says, "Now, Father Lawrence, in thy holy grant consisteth the good of me and Juliet. Without more words, says Friar Lawrence, I will do all I may to make you happy if it in me lie." In the second quarto of 1599, Friar Lawrence begins the scene. "So smile the heaven upon this holy act, that after hours wish sorrow chide us not." "Amen, amen," says Romeo, "come what sorrow can. It cannot countervail the exchange of joy that one short minute gives me in her sight." So these two speeches have almost no resemblance at all. And so what scholars need to do is to choose which version of the scene we are going to use and which version of the scene we are going to say is closer to what Shakespeare actually wrote.
And so the version that we read in classrooms, is it closer to the second quarto?
The version that we read in classrooms is the second quarto, quarto 2 from 1599.
Wow.
What we do is we make a choice between the two texts. We decide which of the texts is probably closest to Shakespeare's authorial manuscript, and we edit that for modern readers.
So students and scholars are essentially doing the same thing, which is looking at Shakespeare's text and trying to pull meaning out of the words.
That's exactly right. We're doing the same thing.
Wow. Well, thanks for meeting with us today, Dr. Pastor. I, for one, didn't know that the two earliest editions of Romeo and Juliet were so different.
Hello, I'm Michael Whitmore, Director of the Folger Shakespeare Library. I'm joined by scholars Gail Kern-Pastor and Ayanna Thompson, three scholars who are going to think alongside you and with you about this play. Before we do, I just want to send a reminder to you to put your questions and comments into our discussion by typing them in the chat box on the webpage. So, Ayanna, Gail, welcome.
It's great to be here.
So let's start out with a question. It seems like Juliet has a special relationship with the nurse. What can you tell us about their relationship? Could we start with you, Gail?
There's that wonderful scene in Act 1, Scene 3, where Juliet and her mother and the nurse are together. And we hear about Juliet's childhood. And because so many of our students are being raised by surrogate moms,
Yes.
It seems to me a wonderful point of connection between students and the play to think about how being raised by another person leads you to think about authority differently, to think about your identity differently, to think about what your values are.
Yeah, yeah. So being outside of one container, which is you, the parents, the family, and finding this other container where you can talk and be alone.
A confidant.
Yes, exactly. That space is so interesting, and it's one where she can speak things that she can't speak to other people, and I think it raises this question of who gets to say what and who gets to speak their mind and their heart. This is something that we've all thought about, I know, and I know you've thought about it, Ayanna.
Yeah,
You could say a little.
I think it's interesting if we think about Romeo, for instance, that he's the character who most identifies with the Petrarchan ideals of how to address love. And so we see him at the beginning of the play talking about Rosaline and using
Over
very,
the top, just so
really
mannered
schmaltzy.
and,
Exactly. And Juliet doesn't do that. She breaks away from that when he overhears her on the balcony scene. And she says, okay, I'm going to have to do away with convention because you've overheard my true thoughts.
Oh, yeah.
So we get this moment of like breaking with convention because her inner thoughts, her inner desires were exposed.
And they're forced to because he's had this chance to hear her do it first.
Exactly,
Yeah,
exactly.
It's a great scene. Let's go to a teacher. We've got a comment that I'd like to start with here. This is Erin Ruggiero.
Hi, I'm Erin Ruggiero. I'm from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I'm a high school English teacher, and I love teaching Romeo and Juliet. And the moment that I love teaching it the most is when students are able to really see Romeo and Juliet as teenagers. And they're able to relate to them and see that, you know, their parents are really being jerks, and that maybe Romeo's just kind of like a schmaltzy guy who's obsessed with women, or maybe he is really this passionate guy, but they just really start to relate to the characters and feel for them and see this as a really cool story rather than this really scary Shakespeare thing. It's so cool.
Well, is it a scary Shakespeare thing? And is Romeo a schmaltzy guy who's over the top in love with women? I think we just started with that, but let's keep going with that and the gender stereotypes or scripts that these characters are playing to and with. This is something that we talk about all the time, I think. But Gail, if you could say a little more about that.
It's amazing when you take a look that Shakespeare is really organizing the play and the scenes of the play to differentiate really quite strongly between the experience of a teenage boy and the experience of a teenage girl at that time. Where is Romeo? He's not talking with his parents. He's out on the street with his friends. Where's Juliet? She's at home. She's got her nurse to talk to. She's got a rather distant father, distant mother. She has no peers at all, and she needs permission to go outside. So that Shakespeare is very careful about distinguishing between these two different ways of life, boy and girl.
And it's good to say that the more you know about this period, the more you can see that there are these little boxes that characters are put in and are speaking to, and that Shakespeare knows where to put them.
Absolutely, but even if you don't know very much, you can still find it. You can
Yes.
find it for yourself.
Yes, that's great. Let's do a question now. I see that we've got one queued up here. Why does it matter that there are two quarto versions of Romeo and Juliet, and how do I teach that to ninth grade kids? Ayana?
It might not matter that there are two quarto versions when you're teaching ninth grade. In fact, I think it might not be the best way to start with students who are encountering Romeo and Juliet for the first time or Shakespeare for the first time. For students who are really interested in the depth of knowledge of Shakespeare, that will be a great moment for them to think about performance and the way that these scripts that we have now are just that, scripts. They came out of performances and not directly from a quill onto a page.
I want to return to this and the question of who feels entitled to perform these plays. But Gail, I know you've already started talking about these quarto differences. Could you say a little bit more about how we can use them in the classroom?
Well, one thing you could do is to take two different versions of the same scene, that from the first quarto or the second quarto. I mean, just a little bit of text, and say to the kids, look, there are these two ways that these texts have come down to us. How are they different? What do they mean? Why would one be better than the other? And I would think perhaps even ninth graders could make some independent and interesting judgments about that.
And they could choose. They could make
And
choices.
they could absolutely
these companies
choose.
did when they had to stage these plays
Which would you?
themselves.
What language would you prefer to speak, and
Yes.
and why?
Yes.
If you were the performer.
Yeah, that's great. Let's take the next question here. What are the possibilities for students who are grappling with identity, race, gender, ability, that is, how ambitious are you, how are you achieving among your peers, sexuality, and how is that connected to studying R&J? Maybe this gets to this question of entitlement, who feels like they own this, who can perform it, who can't, who gets in the spotlight.
Yeah,
Maybe say a little
who
more
gets
about
to
that.
be Romeo? Who gets to
Yeah.
be Juliet? I think in any classroom environment, if you're thinking about doing a performance-based lesson, or if you're trying to get Shakespeare off the page and up on the students up on their feet, from page to stage kind of idea, then it is important to think about how you're going to cast, or how you're going to let your students cast. Are they going to self-select who gets to be their Romeo and who gets to be their Juliet? How is race going to play into this? What about gender? Can you have a black male Juliet? Why and why not? I think it's a great moment to talk about all the ranges of difference in your class through Shakespeare, and you don't have to, hold it off for the Othello day or the Othello unit. That it can be through any of the performances or any of the texts that you're doing if you're doing a performance-based lesson.
When you're doing performance, it comes up potentially all the time.
It will come up.
Yep.
Whether you want it to be a kind of open dialogue or one that's behind the scenes, it will happen.
Yeah.
So I would advocate having an open conversation about it.
Yeah, that's really interesting. We've got another question queued up. What other plays might provide suitable parallels for forbidden love like that of Romeo and Juliet? And this is especially Shakespearean plays. So the topic here is forbidden love.
Midsummer Night's Dream
Yeah.
is about forbidden love. It's about a tyrannical father who and a tyrannical law that says if you don't marry the person that your father wants you to Hermia, you've got to either become a nun or be executed. So that's a very good example. That's a very good example. I mean, the threat of death hangs over her.
Yeah. And we've got Othello too. Prescribed pairing. It's tried in front of the Venetian Senate. It's a crisis of state that's then kind of resolved by this discussion where Othello and then Desdemona kind of tell the story of their love. And that's what gets them out of that jam.
Or even Hamlet, right? I mean, Ophelia's told by her father and brother that she should not think about marrying above herself to Hamlet, right? I mean, so many of the plays are talking about forbidden love, whether it be class, race, or just law, patriarchal societies.
And we should say that one of the things people say about comedy is that it starts with a romantic pairing that is frustrated somehow, and it's usually prohibited, which is what you need in order to have that erotic obstacle dissolve, and then finally You get a marriage at the end of the play. Let's go to this next question. Was Romeo and Juliet based on an earlier play, or did Shakespeare make it all up?
He didn't base it on an earlier play. He based it on Arthur Brooks' poem about Romeo and Juliet, and it was very popular. And Shakespeare was able to figure that out, being a smart guy, about what audiences liked. And so really he adapted Brooks' poem for purposes of the stage.
Could you say a little bit about adapting? Shakespeare's, how freely did he pick and choose?
Shakespeare is one of the great borrowers of all times. I mean,
Yeah.
he finds his sources, and sometimes he hews very closely to the source material, word for word, and sometimes you can see him picking and choosing. The plays are different in that regard, but I mean, he's an amazing user of source material.
He strikes me as a kind of a magpie who's seeing this sparkly little thing and says, I'll take that, and I'll take that. But it raises the question of how much of this can we steal, take, change, and remake?
We do all the time. All of it, all of it has been remade and stolen and lifted and updated and adapted, and I think that's what's great about it. It's still a living thing. It's not dead.
Yeah.
And 450 years later, we've got great material to work with, whether you use his exact words or whether you just lift the plots or just some parts of the text.
And it's a challenge for us because we like to teach the language. I mean, the language is just this incredible part of the Shakespearean score. There's the action, there's the characterization, but just the poetic layering of this language is so appealing to us. And we don't want to give up on it, but we want our students to be able to take it and say, this is really a play about a guy who doesn't know how to talk to a girl, or however they're going to talk about it. Let's talk about this question. What do you think of the Baz Luhrmann film of Romeo and Juliet?
I love it.
I love it.
Yeah. Great soundtrack.
It's so fabulous. And
Yeah.
though what's funny now, and I'm sure teachers will experience this in their classrooms, that Leonardo DiCaprio is no longer young for them, right? So
Yes.
they don't necessarily relate to him as young people did when it came out in, was it 90?
99,
99?
I think it's 99.
Yeah.
There's some great performances in that film. I mean, I can't remember the actor who plays Mercutio, but he was so powerful and
Harold
so
Perrineau.
Thank you, and
Yeah.
so beautiful. And when he dies, your heart just breaks, as it should.
As it
actually,
should, yeah.
as it should.
Marvelous. And how did those of us in the college classroom, did you get a chance to make use of that film version? Did you get to talk about it with your students? Did they want to talk about it?
I did, and I loved it. And I loved it because it was so strong. I mean, in other words, Luhrmann is taking Romeo and Juliet. He's reconceiving it for our moment. He is thrusting it into the context of a gigantic world city. He's putting it in another time and place, and so it gives the really strong message about what you can do with this material.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you so much, both of you, for pitching in, and we're so delighted we could get your questions, and we look forward to continuing this conversation on another occasion. So let's see now how actors find their way into the play, because the way they approach R&J can be so helpful to those who are teaching it. We can get started by looking at two scenes from the Folger Theater's production of Romeo and Juliet. It just closed, and it was a huge hit. Two scenes that you probably know pretty well. There's 1-3, where Lady Capulet introduces the idea of marrying Paris, and 1-5, the palm-to-palm scene. Afterwards, Peggy will be back with Aaron Weaver, the actor whom you will see right now as Juliet.
Tell me, daughter Juliet, how stands your disposition to be married?
It is an honor that I dream not of.
Well, think of marriage now. Younger than you, here in Verona, ladies of esteem are made already mothers. By my count, I was your mother much upon these years that you are now made. Thus then, in brief, the valiant Paris seeks you for his love.
A man, young lady. Lady, so
of young Paris' face, and find delight writ there with beauty's pen. And what obscured in this fair volume lies, find written in the margent of his eyes. So shall you share all that he doth possess by having him.
If I profane with my unworthiest hand this holy shrine, the gentle sin is this: my lips, two blushing pilgrims, ready stand to smooth that rough touch with a tender kiss.
Good pilgrim, you do wrong your hands too much, which mannerly devotion shows in this. For saints have hands that pilgrims' hands do touch, and palm to palm is holy palmer's kiss.
Have not saints lips and holy palmers too?
Aye, pilgrim, lips that they do use in prayer.
And dear saint, let lips do what hands do? They pray, grant thou lest faith turn to despair.
Saints do not move, though grant for prayer's sake.
Then move not. While my prayers effect, I take. Thus from my lips by thine my sin is purged.
Then have my lips the sin that they have took.
Sin from my lips. Oh, trespass sweetly urged, give me my sin again.
Hi again, and hi Erin Weaver. And before we get started, we want to remind you that we'd like you to keep those comments and questions coming in the chat box. Erin, we've just seen a bit of your Juliet, just ended with a little bit of making out with Romeo, all good. And we know you've played lots of other Shakespearean roles, but we want to zoom in on this one. And so we're going to start right off with a question. And the question is, you've just heard you got the part of Juliet. This is, you have to go back in time a little bit. You just heard you get the part. How do you start? How do you start thinking about it?
Most important thing I do is I read the play over and over again and take a lot of notes and ask myself every time I'm reading it, what do I have in common with the character? And this is really my job with any part that I play. And this is the question I ask myself all the time. What do I have in common with Juliet? And how do I relate to her?
And you do that by you read and read and read.
Yeah, and you take notes and you just pay attention. You make sure that you understand every line, you understand what other people are saying about her and what Shakespeare's telling you about her, and you try to connect with that.
Excellent, thanks so much. We have a clip from one of our teachers at the NCTE conference, and we'll go to that.
One of the challenges I find is this question of are they in love or are they in lust? And I have to admit that from my point of view, I'm not always sure. But so it engenders a lot of debate in class about really if one is 14, 16, can one really know what true love is?
So, love or lust, what do you think?
I think love. And in the production that we had done, it was really important to us that Romeo and Juliet looked like they were really in love. And I'm sure a lot of adults in the audience thought it was lust. And I'm sure a lot of kids said, that's love. I feel like that right now. And the most important thing is I think the text really supports that these two young people feel like they are in love. Whether or not it's really love, I don't know. I think that's up to the audience to decide. But while I was playing Juliet, it was important for me to really portray a young girl who is head over heels in that moment for lots of different reasons. So yeah, I think she thinks she's in love.
Love it. And you thought you were in love. You
Yeah.
knew you were in love.
Yeah.
Got it.
Yeah.
Excellent. We have a question. The play says that Juliet is 13 or 14. Is that how you played the role?
I
we
did.
just saw you, so we know a little bit about how you looked.
Yeah, I mean, generally speaking, I mean, I did try to get close to that. You know, there's a lot of different kinds of 13 and 14. There's old, there's young, and I tried to go with an age that made sense to me, with a kind of 13 or 14 that made sense to me in that character. And I tried to do that through some vocal adjustments, just putting it up a little bit higher in my voice, her voice, and you know, just kind of fidgety, showing some insecurities, just discomfort in her body, and it wasn't the most important thing, but it was important to make sure that people in the audience identified with a teenager.
And so I should just point out, I can point out that you're 33.
Yes, yeah.
So actually, something I forgot to say about you is that your dad is a high school teacher.
That's right.
I should have said that right off. All good. So tell us a little bit about the language. How did you work with the language, or how does the language work for you as you get into that part?
Yeah. One of the things that I do is, first of all, you have to understand every single thing you're saying. You have to look up every word. You have to make sure you don't look up just the first meaning, but the second, the third, the fourth, the fifth, and make sure that you know at every moment what you are saying. And then I do a thing called paraphrasing, where I try to put it in my own words. How would I say that? It would be less poetic, but how would I say that? And then I try and match that energy and clarity onto the way Shakespeare says it, keeping it very natural and realistic, and in this production, contemporary, but also poetic.
Perfect. Do we have a clip or a question? Okay, let's go to a clip. A teacher talking about the boys in Romeo and Juliet. We're going to ask you about the boys.
I love the Mercutio Benvolio characters as a nice segue and change from the love story itself. And Mercutio in particular is so feisty and fun to read. The kids really grab onto him.
So what about these guys?
Yeah, you know, I think that it's important that you've got these guys that are, they're very into the violence, they're very body, very sexual, and you have the opposition between their energy and Romeo's energy, which is very poetic, a little depressed, and I think that opposition in every production is really important, because you've got Juliet who falls in love with Romeo, not Mercutio, and you have to ask yourself why. And
Say more about that. Why?
Yeah, well, I mean, everybody can answer this differently. I mean, every production can be different. For me, I tried to make a connection between Romeo and one of my parents. So in this production, my father was a lot like Mercutio, very violent, very bawdy, very vulgar, even though she loves him. And her mother was a little bit more depressed, a little bit more tender, a little bit more poetic. And I think that we often, when we choose our partners, choose people that remind us of our mother and our father, or our father. And in this, we kind of matched Romeo's energy with my mother's, and the boy's energy with Dad's energy. And so Juliet falls in love with a more tender, gentler soul than all of the other men, who are just so much more intense and violent and, you know, overwhelming.
It was interesting what Gail said earlier about us falling in love with you and Romeo, but also everybody falling in love with Mercutio.
Yeah.
Except you.
That's
Except
right.
Juliet.
That's right.
That's great.
Yeah.
That's great. Here's another question. How should we talk to students about Romeo's fickleness, and does it undermine what happens in the play?
I don't think it does. I mean, I think we know teenagers all the time who are fickle. We're all fickle, but especially in your teenager years, there's so much coming at you, and you know, their minds change all the time, and what they do from moment to moment isn't less than, because they're fickle. There's a lot, and I think Romeo, one moment he loves Rosalind, but she doesn't return the love, and Juliet does, and so boom, he moves forward with that, and that's a true movement, and I think that his fickleness does not undermine his actions. I think, and if you were talking about actions, you talk about his suicide at the end. I think there's lots of other reasons other than just him being in love with Juliet and her dying. Lots of other reasons to justify why he might kill himself at the end.
So say a little bit about, and I heard you talk about this a little bit elsewhere, about Juliet's suicide.
Yeah.
Because one of the things that makes it tough for us to teach sometimes is
Yes.
because this is like very serious stuff.
Yeah.
So say a tiny bit about that.
One of the most important things to me was to create a character from the word go, a Juliet that you meet in the first moment, that looking back you can understand why she would kill herself. So often you see productions where the Juliet is this gentle, delicate flower or victim, but for me, in studying the text, I saw that she was an incredibly strong, smart, powerful young woman who was also scared and alone at times, but she always moved forward and tried to get out of her situations or solve her situations. And we tried to create a world in which the father, who she loved so much, the minute he says, you know, die, be out on the streets, I mean, if you don't do what I say, you're dead to me. You know, we tried to create a world in which so many things happen that she feels, we of course know differently, but she feels she has no other choice but to kill herself, and that's a young woman who's capable of that, sadly.
Thank you. Thank you for that. We have a question for you. Have you ever had a director that doesn't see your character the way that you do?
Yeah.
What happens then?
You keep talking. You keep talking until you find the middle ground. And I think the most important thing, and this is the best thing about working with Shakespeare, is you look to the text. You support whatever you're doing by the text, not just one line, but the whole thing. And this is why it was so interesting in the earlier conversation about how different the text is.
Yes.
And which text are you working on? I think you make sure that no matter what choices you make, it is backed up by that play.
And you come to some common ground with the director.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Tell us more about playing somebody. Well, you talked about playing somebody who's young, but sometimes we get, as we teach this stuff, we sometimes get mixed up. We think that people in Shakespeare's time, that girls got married when they were 14 and 15, and they didn't.
Right.
But this is the play that he is, and as Gail said, the play that he's taken his ideas from another source and made into a play.
Right.
So in terms of the other characters in the play, actually say something about the parents and and in terms of they're much older, right? Mature, supposed to know what they're doing.
Yeah.
How does that work exactly?
Yeah, well, this kind of goes back to what I was talking about earlier, you know, trying to create a Juliet that would, at the end, actually kill herself.
Yeah.
We really explored, you know, within the text, her relationship to the two parents, and we really worked on, you can see in one of the scenes where Capulet is talking to Paris, you know, she is the hopeful lady of my earth. They're clearly very close. So at the end, when he gets so upset with her for choosing Paris, it's, you know, that's devastating, and that's important to show the difference there. And then maybe a more dissonant relationship with her mother in the beginning.
Yeah.
You know, and really, and using those relationships to justify why she does what she does is very important. There's lots of different ways to do that.
Great, thank you so much. We have one last question for you. Erin, how do you think Juliet would respond if she knew about Rosalind?
That's a great question. That's a really great question. You know,
just speak right from your gut.
I think she does respond. Even though she doesn't know Rosalind, she knows a guy who likes to woo. And he says, I would cross the farthest ocean with the farthest shore and the farthest this to find you. And she says, hang on. I need you to stop swearing and stop doing this and stop doing that. I need you to just pronounce your love faithfully and true. None of this wooing and poetry and everything. Let's just cut to the chase. I think she sees a guy who usually knows how to woo ladies left and right, and she's asking for the simple truth. Do you love me and will you marry me? So I think she sees it and she gets rid of it and she gets the guy to hunker down and get married.
Get busy. Yeah. Erin Weaver, thank you so much for sharing all this insight with us. We want to keep telling you to send your questions into the chat box. And now we're going to take all of this Romeo and Juliet-ness into the most important place of all, your classroom. We've included several teaching modules in your packet that connect students with language, and that's because we know that actively getting to the language is a surefire way for students to get inside these complex texts, and you know if we're talking about complex texts, what we're talking about. And now we're going to begin all this by showing you Teaching Shakespeare Institute alum Mark Miazga and his 9th graders at City College High School in Baltimore. His students are up on their feet as they begin to own Shakespeare's language and also own the play Romeo and Juliet. So let's have a look at Mark and his students.
See, Captain Nice.
Oh, where is Romeo?
All right, nice to meet you, Noah.
Nice to meet you too.
Yeah, thanks for coming. So today we're going to be hurling Shakespearean insults at each other. And lastly, we're going to look at how reading lines in different tones helps change the meaning and our perceptions of characters. All right, so we'd like to have a seat with this group. So the first thing we're going to do today is a Shakespearean insult game. And what I've done is I want you to see that this world of Verona that Romeo and Juliet were living in is one that was full of violence and conflict. And I want you to see that the language of the play reflects that violence and conflict.
Out, you green sickness carry-on. You baggage. You tallow face.
A plague of both houses. They have made worms, meat of me. Your house.
A dog, a cat, a mouse, a rat, to scratch a man's got.
The love I bear thee can afford no time than this. Thou art of them.
Speak not, reply not, do not answer me. My fingers itch.
Oh, serpent hid with flowering face.
Thou detestable mouth, thou worm of death.
I do bite my tongue, sir.
All right, folks. So I hope you can all feel the hatred in the air, feel that conflict and violence of this society that we're reading about. Now I want to do a little bit more analysis, and I want to look at how does tone create meaning. Okay, how does tone create meaning? I'm going to assign you a line. You're going to determine 2 tones to read it in, determine the effects, write it down on your chart, and then we're going to call you up here to actually perform it the 2 ways and describe how that changes the meaning of that certain situation or character and how it might affect the play as a whole. Any questions?
The first tone is angry.
Nurse, where's my daughter? Call her forth to me.
That makes it seem as to where the nurse and Lady Capulet's relationship is not close, where Lady Capulet is upset in a way to trigger a quick response from the nurse. The second tone is peaceful.
Nurse, where's my daughter? Call her forth to me.
The effect of that is that they're like comfortable with each other, as to where they could talk to each other, not loud and like angry, as to where they're just like really close, heart-to-heart friends, where she could get a good response that's not too loud and intense.
Thank you.
Love those students. Remember to keep your questions and your comments about teaching coming in the chat box. Joining me now in the studio is Subiando Hunch. Why am I calling you that? Subiando Hitch, Teaching Shakespeare Institute alum and also master teacher at the Institute, and an English teacher at Carlisle High School in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. And she's the author of the Romeo and Juliet, Teaching Romeo and Juliet chapter in Shakespeare Set Free. So welcome to you, Sue.
It's great to be here.
We're going to start right off with a teacher in the street or a teacher at the NCTE conference clip.
My name is Jessica Pontu. I teach 9th and 10th grade English in Marianna, Arkansas, a town about this big, an hour out of Memphis. And I've never taught Romeo and Juliet before. I'm excited. I was actually Lady Capulet in high school. And so I'm really excited to help them understand those powerful themes, but I'm nervous that they won't see themselves in the story.
So, Jessica has never taught this play before, though she has played Lady Capulet in high school. That's a big plus. So that's a great prompt for you. How do you start? You've never taught it before, or maybe you want to try to start it a different way. How do you go about it?
Well, I thought Mark and his students showed everyone a great way to get into a scene from Shakespeare right off the bat. I mean, you saw the smiles on the students' faces as they got up on their feet, were given a bit of language and a chance to play with it and explore it before they really delved into the entire scene or an act.
So connection with the language first.
Right.
That's kind of a mantra that we have here because
Right.
we've seen it work over and over and over. So, and you've put more than a couple of things in people's packets about getting kids connected to language. So even though we don't have a classroom here of kids, and we wish we did, give us an example of what to do.
Well, one of the activities in the packet is 2-line scenes. So in the packet, there are a list of a whole bunch of great lines from Romeo and Juliet. Cut them into slips.
Yep.
We just happen to have a few
talk,
here.
You talk, and I'll be the prop person.
Okay, and then give one to each of your students. Have them spread the desks, put everything away, give lots of room for the kids to move around. Give them a line, have them walk around, practice saying it to each other, and then say freeze. Once the kids freeze, have them get together with a partner, have them look over their lines, and have them pull together a very quick scene with a beginning, a middle, and an end. Props if they like, though they're not necessary, and use great gusto with the language, and then they perform for each other in a little festival of two-line scenes, which gives them a chance to experience the language and performance with their community of learners. Let's do one.
Exactly. So we've
Okay.
cut up the lines that you all have, we've cut these up because we're very good.
Okay.
And we're just going to grab these
Oh my.
and do a two-line play. You go.
Okay, my naked weapon is out.
Ooh, he is not the flower of courtesy.
Oh, never. Okay.
So
great.
you have those things going on all over your
Yes,
classroom.
yes.
And so kids start with one line, even kids who, for whom reading is tough.
Actually, sometimes my students who find reading difficult find these words just magic, and they're all over it. They have such a blast with having a chance to say this language that is so powerful, so muscular, so energizing, and so unexpected.
Perfect. Okay, and then there's more in the packet on this, but language in the mouth, great way to start.
Gotcha.
So Jessica, for you and everybody else who needs to know that. All right, we have a question for you.
Okay.
How do you help students overcome the initial fear of Shakespeare? A great question.
Well, you know, it's more of the same. What you do is you give the students an arc of activities. You start them off with small pieces and then let them find themselves in the language, and then all of a sudden that text becomes a pathway into stories and ideas that just resonate with them. Act 1, Scene 1 is a great place. For example, with that act, what I do is I have the students, once again, we push the desks aside, sit on the floor. Everybody has a hard copy of the text. We read it 3 times. First time, it's once around. Everybody speaks, and each line, the speaker changes each time a new line comes up, and we talk about the words that emerge. What words don't we understand? What words catch our attention? What does it tell us? Second time around, each student is given a character and holds that character for the entire scene. We then talk about the who, the what, the where, the when, the why, and the how of that scene. We give it the frame. And then finally, we assign characters again, get the kids up on their feet. Students who don't have parts are the directors, and we actually get it moving. And by the time that scene is finished, the students have fully invested in it, and they've started to do some excellent close reading. It's just on their feet.
And they don't even know they're doing close reading.
Right.
3D Shakespeare, actually, is a good way to call
Thank
that. The other thing about students' fear is often, I think students fear because as teachers, we fear it.
Right.
We think, oh my gosh, we have to teach this whole thing. Kids have to know what every word means. We have to start with Act 1, Line 1, Scene 1, and go right to the end of the play, and we don't. And so that's something that we often, among all of us, and I hope among all of us, we'll be talking about that as we go forward. Other question for you. I've been using the Shakespeare Made Easy versions with my students. What do you think of them?
Oh, Shakespeare Made Easy. I choose not to use those versions. I find that if you take a look at those parallel texts and you look at the Shakespeare next to the Made Easy version, all of a sudden you see how much life and energy is pulled right out of that language. And that's not what I want for my students. I want them to experience everything that makes Shakespeare Shakespeare, and it begins with the words. The other thing, too, with all of that language is that if the kids, feel like I don't trust them enough, then they're never going to just go with it and take off as learners.
And actually, I would say I have an opinion about
Yes.
this, and that is I feel like the publishers of those books feel like, what I say to students is they feel like you're not smart enough to understand the real thing, and also in some ways I think they feel like teachers are not smart enough to teach the real thing, and the real thing is there's a perfectly good way in and around the real thing.
And part of all of that is it's a process of mutual discovery where the students and the teachers work on all of this language together, and they find a way to bring it into their understanding and into life.
Everybody's learning all the time.
Yes, all the time.
Okay, so
Yes.
Karen Mitchum, a teacher in Arkansas, and Ashley Allison, a teacher in Texas, talked to us about the fact that their students love to, these 2 different kinds of schools, completely 2 different teachers, love to stage the big fight in Act 3, the Mercutio-Tybalt fight.
Right.
And of course that goes with this little strand that we've been talking about, which is everybody loves Mercutio. How do your students, if your students say to you, okay, we want to stage this, how do you work that in a classroom?
In a classroom, as I mentioned, that 3-dimensional Shakespeare
Same
just
process.
works perfectly.
Okay.
Same process, Take a few minutes in the middle, though, to give the kids some basics on sword fighting, and then also give the students who don't have character parts in that scene some insults or some of those lines from the two-line Shakespeare, have them enter as citizens, bring the principal in as the prince, and just explode that scene as a class.
Perfect. Oh, that's great. That's great. New question for you we have. How important is the technical delivery of the lines for the actor or the student?
Well, for me, as I'm working with the students with the
You
lines,
answer for students.
Sure. You know, I think I want them to have an opportunity to let the language evolve. I don't stand over their shoulder the entire time. I don't make all kinds of corrections. I let the students start to work through it. I let them start to understand it and to change it. I ask questions. I help them discover. We get input from the other students, and together, that understanding evolves.
It's also, I mean, in terms of technical delivery, I'm not exactly sure what is meant by that, but I feel like this is for students anyway.
Right.
This is a process. It's a process, and so they're getting those words in their mouths and they're rolling them around, and so the product of how they deliver that, at least to me as a teacher, is not as important as the process of what's going on in their heads as they take on this language. I'm not an actor and you're not an actor, so I don't think we can answer that question. But we'll grab Erin the next time and see what she has to say about that.
One thought that did come to mind is we oftentimes give the students a single line, and we ask them to take an opportunity to inflect different words, to say the line in multiple different variety of ways. And what happens is as they tease out different meaning by teasing out each word, the line shifts a little bit, and we start to talk about which of those readings makes more sense with the character, a particular interpretation that goes on. So that evolution is great.
And Mark's kids talking about tone, doing different tone things, do the same thing. Other question. What do you do when you have an assigned role or ask a student to read and he just refuses to get into it? I'm saying, just refuses to get into it, acts either bored or downright hostile to the dramatic act. That's a great question because we've all been there.
Well, one of the things that I have done in my classroom, especially when I do an activity with Act 3, Scene 1, when we're taking it and breaking it into chunks and we're giving a group of students to take each chunk of the technical climax, is I post on the board a list of the characters for each bit of the scene, and then I just say, okay, volunteer, go for it. And I don't know why, but it just works. It's something magical. Some of the bolder students volunteer right away, or some of the students who have a feeling for a particular character volunteer right away, or some of the students see a friend going in a particular direction right away, and that cast list somehow always fills up. And then sometimes I think it's when you do allow the students to have some autonomy and work in groups on it, and they do know they have to put something together, they make the casting decisions themselves. And so they're working together as a unit, they take care of each other, and somehow the problem does seem to take care of itself.
I also think we've seen a couple of things today that help us with that, like Mark's students doing the insults back and forth. So you start with a word. You have a couple of words that you put together, or then you move on to a line. So then when you get to be asking students to read in various ways, it's not entirely new, and so some of that stuff might be helpful to you.
And all the students in the class are doing that activity, and it's just something that seems comfortable and natural for everyone as a whole, and the climate is all making a community of performers.
Which is great.
Right.
We have another question for you, I understand. If you had to really boil it down, what would be the one major understanding you'd want students to walk away with about Romeo and Juliet?
Well, one of the things that I've come to feel, and I love my high school students, I've been teaching for a long time now, and I watch them go through the highs and the lows of life, and they understand things on a very deep level. And I think one of the reasons that Shakespeare resonates so much for me is his understanding of the antithesis of life, of the sweet sorrow and the brawling love and the loving hate. And kids get that, and they get it on a deep level. So when we work with Romeo and Juliet, we talk a lot about that antithesis and that push and pull that's present in life. And they feel like that's a connecting point to them for Shakespeare, and I know it's a connecting point to Shakespeare for me.
You and them, because you're in this together with them. Yeah, as we all are together. We have another question. Oh, sorry, we have a clip. We have a wonderful clip from Ashley Mondale from Leechburg, Pennsylvania. Yes.
A challenge is always the language, but surprisingly, my special education students always do much better than the ones that are considered gifted or higher level. So we really, really have a great time breaking it down and talking about the emotions behind it.
So Ashley's talking about her special ed students, her special needs students, and how they seem to have an easier time sometimes than her more, she said, gifted students. So what's your experience and what would you have to say about that?
Well, you know, it also goes back to that antithesis and that idea that life is a push and a pull and a tug. And I think because sometimes my reluctant learners feel that so deeply in the language, they're not worried about the GPA, they're not worried about the tests to the same extent that they're you know, the students who are more oriented toward achievement are. I think they drop their guard. I think they drop their guard, they have fun with it, and I think they're in some instances comforted by the fact that this playwright has captured some side of life as they know it, and they just go after it.
And these active ways into the text,
Yes.
I know, are really useful with special needs kids.
Yes.
I mean, I think we've all seen that in our work. Excellent, thank you. We do have a question. Does Shakespeare live anywhere in the Common Core?
Oh.
What a question.
Absolutely, Shakespeare lives in the Common Core. He even has his own statement in there about the fact that students need to be encountering Shakespeare throughout the course of their high school career. And so we've just been given open door to make sure that that's a piece of every child's high school education.
Yes, he's one. I think teachers are nervous some about the
Yes.
Common Core and where classical literature is falling, and that's
Right.
because of the instructional text that we're talking about and how literacy now goes across many more subjects. Responsibility for literacy goes across many more subjects than just English. But yes, he's one of the few authors mentioned in the Common Core, and if you want to talk about analyzing complex texts and pointing to evidence and all that stuff, he's the guy.
If you could only study one text, it would be one of his.
Yeah, well, we're a little biased, but
Just a little.
Just a tiny bit. Another question we
Yes.
have. What's the best way to end a Shakespeare unit?
Well, from my perspective, it's a performance-based project where the students take everything they've learned about the language and the characters in the story and then take another look at a scene and build it and refine it and put everything into action. So for me, that's the culminating
So
piece.
tell
Yeah.
specifically, you had millions of Shakespeare units. So tell us specifically a real quick example of one fabulous wrap-up.
You know, have the students do prompt booked, which is an activity that is something that people in the theater business use all the time. It's a copy of the text where annotations are made, which helps the students visualize the performances they want to see it happen. They're making choices. They become collaborators with Shakespeare. What pieces of the text do they keep? What pieces of the text do they lose? How are they going to style their Romeo and Juliet? What time period do they want to set it in? Why is that time period relevant and important?
Do they work together or in groups?
They work
in groups or alone?
They work in teams.
In teams. Got it. We have another clip?
Yes.
I'm Gwendolyn Nixon, and I teach in Richmond, Virginia. And I love Shakespeare, particularly Romeo and Juliet. And what I like about teaching Romeo and Juliet, I think, is that dynamic that there are two families who have opposing views, and kids can jump into that right away. They understand that kind of conflict.
So Gwendolyn talks about the two families having opposing views and that her students immediately can jump into that and can understand that in terms of making connections. I think about what Erin said about making connections between herself and Juliet when she's trying to get ready to play Juliet, and she's talking about her kids making connections with what's going on in the play, as several have said, several people have said earlier, including you. But hers is particularly focused on the two families who disagree with one another.
Two families. Well, if I can take it right back into my classroom today, we were talking about that issue, and we were talking about how feuds just spread out, and it's not just the two people initially involved. The tentacles just reach far beyond the family and deeply into the community. And I just asked my students, I said, come on, how many of you have ever sat at a lunch table where two people all of a sudden weren't getting along? And the eyes rolled and the groans emerged, and I said, you know, what happens? And they talked about the breakdown that occurs there and how when that breakdown occurs, everybody has to sometimes make a choice, and sometimes that choice is just to walk away. So that's in their own world. But then when you start looking at family connections as well, and the students understand that the push and pull that exists between families that are important to them through all different kinds of loss and partings makes life difficult for them, and they get caught in the middle a lot.
So it's a very meaningful touch point for them.
Yeah.
Great. We have one more question, and this is going to be our last question for you. How did you build a rubric for your performance-based projects?
For my performance-based projects, what I found is that assessment, I think, is the most useful when it's ongoing throughout the course of the project. What you want to do is continue to scaffold it so as you make an assignment, say, for example, some notations on the prompt book, you get a look at those and see how the students are doing, what kind of a track they're heading on, maybe make some suggestions. Then a little bit later on, there might be an additional grade based on, or some form of assessment, based on the interpretive choices that they're making with regard to the peripherals and how that goes back into the text.
Great.
You know, and then eventually there might be a performance-based grade as well.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Sue, and all of our guests and participants for being a part of this live masterclass. We want to create great professional development together with you. A couple of things. Next week, we'll archive this masterclass and send you an email with a link so you can access it. But tomorrow, we're going to send you our survey. It'll only take 10 minutes. We know you have no time. And after we get your thoughts and suggestions, we'll be back to you at the beginning of the new year with some next steps for us, we think. And of course, anytime, tell us anything we need to know. pobrien@folger.edu. If you're interested in continuing these conversations that we've started here, get busy in that Google group. Big thanks to our producing partners at Alabama Public Television who make this possible. Parting is such sweet, you know. But as we wrap, we're going to leave you with our first ever English teacher mashup. Take care.
I've taught Romeo and Juliet for as many years as I've taught 9th grade, and I go back to it each year because I learn something new from it each time. And I think one of the things I really love teaching about it is just having kids delve into the language and having fun with it, and also how it's still pertinent and relatable to their lives today. Like people who have feuds and can like love and hate, you know, motivate us to do things. One of my favorite lines is, "You kiss by the book."
The reason I love teaching Romeo and Juliet is because many of my students come in saying, "We already know the story, miss, but by the time we're finished with Act 1, Scene 1, and what the puns mean," and they go home and interview what type of boyfriend or girlfriend their parents would like for them to marry, I have their attention for the whole play.
I think my favorite part about Shakespeare is once I've really sucked the students in and they start to realize that this is a better story than pretty much any of the movies that they've seen, and they think that the movie's always going to be better, and then when we watch a movie at the end, they get really, really mad when the movie is different and not like we read it. And that's like one of the best moments for them to realize that the text in the book and how Shakespeare made it is always better than somebody else's interpretation.
I taught Romeo and Juliet by way of Marvin Gaye, and it was fabulous. It was fabulous. We started off with the themes of love, romance, conventional love, civil disobedience, civil unrest, etc., through the music of Marvin Gaye.
I love teaching Romeo and Juliet. I think it's a play that's really accessible to students in terms of teenagers. I love incorporating current nonfiction and kind of bringing in stories of their own romance, their own love lives. They love acting out Romeo's lines from the balcony scene, and I like to engage them in conversations about why they don't talk that way, have them work on what a balcony scene would sound like today, and they have a lot of fun, and it's great to see them kind of getting into the language, looking at how Shakespeare used language to communicate, and connecting that with how we use language today to communicate, or how we don't use language today to communicate. So it's a great way to get them thinking about the words we use and the power that words have.
My most famous or favorite line of Romeo and Juliet would have to be probably Romeo when he is below the balcony and he sees Juliet up on the balcony, and he says, "But soft, what light through yonder window breaks? It is the east, and Juliet is the sun. Arise, fair sun, and kill the envious moon." ... I could go on. I'm done.